So yeah, a little bit about what we do. I'll try to maybe make this very brief. Um, we actually we're back in startup mode actually after a long time, and actually some of the most visible parts of our portfolio for the last, I would say 10 to 12 years has been a very sustained sort of an engagement with the hospitality industry. So we've been working on mostly bars, restaurants, clubs, stuff like that. We worked across India, created lots of venues, and around 4 to 5 years ago, I think we started something called the Bandra project in the studio. And this was a sort of a multi-headed inquiry into what makes the suburb work and what makes it tick. And we kind of realized that a lot of our existing portfolio was starting to make lesser and lesser sense because the inquiries that we were kind of coming across with our engagement with culture seemed to be a lot more interesting. So on the back of that, what I'd like to talk to you today about is just the different thought fragments that we're juggling right now. And we're actually actively looking to shift out of hospitality and out of the kind of work that we were doing into a slightly more different zone. So maybe what I could start with is a little bit of an understanding. These are just really small thought fragments really. They're not really coherent right now in our own heads, so I thought it would be a great platform to share all my confusion here with you guys and hopefully get some clarity after this. So I think one thing that we have realized is that the past and the future are multiple narratives. There's not a single history, there's not a single future. And I feel what is really powerful is also to understand that us as a civilization, we are at a cusp where decisions we make today will actually be looked back from the future and what side of the future do we want to be on. There's this very interesting new spirituality emerging through dataism. I think it was kind of popularized by movies like The Matrix, where people look at the whole universe in a system of ones and zeros. And this is the world of algorithms, this is the world of biochemistry. We're finding that bits and atoms are interchangeable, and this whole paradigm is actually coming very much to the forefront. And I feel as a studio we're very actively trying to engage with data and trying to see where this data exists and what we can do with it and how we can empower design. If you look at certain studies that were done in Boston, doctors and nurses make up to 9.3 million decisions in the ICU every year. And can you imagine, out of 9.3 million decisions in the ICU, not a single one going wrong and someone losing their life, right? So if we actually look at the human brain as something that is in dire need to be augmented and in dire need for quick data to be accessible, then one starts looking at ourselves in a very different way. We're trying to now look for meaningful answers which are outside the scope of humanity. So we're trying to see where certain sort of processes and certain sort of thought processes exist which are outside the scope of the pure human brain, right? So just consider these forms. This is actually an experiment by this architect and programmer Michael Hansmeyer, and he took a very simple Greek column of the Doric order and let loose a bunch of mathematical algorithms on it. And what he came up with was actually impossible to pre-visualize. It's impossible to actually pre-visualize these forms because they're created using complex mathematical algorithms which are looping back on themselves. And if you actually look at a creation of this kind, it's a very, very interesting sign of what is to come. So if we're actually looking at making a choice today and to see what kind of future we want to inhabit, that's a very interesting provocation as well. We also take our own insights with a lot of self-doubt. Because I feel any kind of future speculation at its base level is also a waste of time. If anyone is confidently standing up and telling you they know what the world looks like in 2200 or 2100 even, you can very easily tell them to shut up and sit down, because we are very actively reprogramming our own minds. The first step in sort of biomimicry is actually going to be to reprogram the way humans think. And how does one start visualizing the thoughts of a brain that doesn't exist today? Right? How does one start thinking about what a bee intelligence is, what is a hive intelligence? What's the intelligence of a brain that is extremely slow but has extremely deep memory? Like what if you could remember events 100 years ago but are very tough to make sense of it today? So all these are sort of interesting questions that one is sort of thinking about, and really where that leaves us is with a lot of confusion as a studio. I can maybe share with you a little bit of what we're doing right now. So to sort of follow all these interesting thought directions, we thought it would be just best to cut the pipeline with all the earlier work that we were doing, move cities, set up shop in Goa. That's our studio in Goa, which we sort of cohabit with two other like-minded or similarly confused studios, which is Quicksand and another policy research company called Tandem. And we think about all these things and try to make sense of it in some sort of meaningful way in Goa. It's a lot of fun and it's a very cool studio. So the first thing I'd like to, I'm going to get arthritis this way, I'll stand here. So the first thing we're trying to do is to create livable maps. And one thing that we are actively doing is to map out 2035. 2035 selected primarily because it's not too far in the future already. It's not too far in the future that we can't really completely visualize. There's a lot of data that exists around 2035 through tech, through climate change, things like that, and we're able to actually engage with. So this is an ongoing map. We've been working on this for the last 2 years or so. The idea is to sort of create a very livable, understandable map of what the world is going to be like in 2035, and then try to create meaningful design sort of interventions that allow us to inhabit that world more interestingly. One of the things that we've learned to do is to pick our battles, because we felt like whenever any kind of future engagement starts, the last thing we want to do is to try to address everything. So as a group, what we've tried to do is to address the future of cities and the future of craft. Both these two sort of main buckets are really that fuels most of our sort of research currently. I'll just share with you some interesting projects that are shaping up within these two domains. This is a collaborative project we're working on with studios in the UK, which is PAN and Studio PSK. It's a very, very interesting work with the Internet of Things. So we started creating future artifacts, and one of the things was to create a newspaper from the future. And so here you look at essentially the black rhino is extinct. The first 200-year-old seen as a success in battle against aging as a disease, right? So you have increased life expectancy, you have all these kind of scenarios which are being touched upon by medicine, but are being articulated in a more believable, more sort of engageable form through newspaper headlines. We actually then mapped out 3 distinct scenarios to work with. One is looking at the future of data and how data is actually going to become our next building block. So we're going to slowly evolve out of using brick and masonry. We're going to start using semiconductor materials to build our cities, where the building itself has the capacity to generate and store data. There's supposed to be a collapse of antibiotics, broad spectrum antibiotics, because of the microdosing that's been happening across the food chain. So in a scenario like this, what would happen if someone sneezed in your face in a local train, right? Would that spark civil war? Would actually everyone get together and lynch that guy? What's going to happen? So how does that change the aspect of designing for public space? We were looking at Chernobyl as the last refuge of the human species, because dystopias that have been written off across various different ages are now becoming biodiversity havens. And cities like we were talking about Bangalore, I mean, they're becoming very tough to live more and more. So essentially, places that are the sites of old disasters, like Chernobyl, for example, the wolf population is multiplied by 12 in the last years, after the years after the nuclear sort of explosion. So in some twisted way, the best thing that happened to Chernobyl was that nuclear reactor meltdown. This is some of the things that we try to do. So we try to create artifacts from the future that have been rescued in the present. And these are ways of talking about the kind of world that we're going to inhabit. So this is a rejected city planning application by a hypothetical Italian citizen who's moving to Chernobyl. And he submitted his application to the town council, and it's being rejected because his dog kennel is too close to the thriving wolf population. So these are sort of storytelling sort of scenarios which one is able to then visualize using sort of design speculation. This is a program I do at NID, so I take the final year exhibition design course. And we also engage in a lot of storytelling. So this is something that the students put together. It's a newspaper of the future set in the old city. It's called Pol Khol because of the poles there. And yeah, it sort of studies marriage, it studies transgender marriage in Ahmedabad. We actually realized through research that Ahmedabadis are uniquely qualified to move to Mars. Because they're primarily vegetarian society. They're used to living in extremes of temperature. They're very used to sort of living in close proximity. Now they're vegetarian. Yeah. I mean, and non-veg is very, very resource heavy to grow on Mars, right? So you will primarily be a vegetarian civilization when you move to Mars. So Gujarati is actually amazingly qualified to be the first few inhabitants of Mars. All this obviously comes out through research. So some of the things that the students came up with, so this is the Mars One poles where they're actually reconstructing poles on Mars using sort of additive manufacture. That's the textile spinning industry starting again because of the pharma companies taking over the textile mills and creating sort of wearable textile, medicinal textiles, things like that. The third thing we do is data worship in the studio. So most of us are sort of agnostic to religion, but we're starting to worship data in a big way. This is a timeline of, so we pulled out 200-year-old data in Bombay from the old Maharashtra gazettes, and we started mapping out various different scenarios on a 200-year timeline. And this is the sort of rise and fall of mills in Bombay, which is generally very well documented. This is the rise and fall of theatre. And what's really interesting is if you overlay these two graphs, you realize that all the out-of-work mill workers are the ones who started off the theatre movement in Bombay. So I think what we're trying to do as a studio is trying to make data more interesting. Like you can read stories into data, you can actually pull out design situations from data. And another really, really interesting thing that started happening was we started seeing this graph everywhere. It's called, we're using it in the studio, the name is the boomtown graph because it follows a very typical boomtown trajectory. It starts with some early movers, there's a gold rush where a lot of people are jumping onto the bandwagon trying to get as much bang for their buck. There's a little period of stability where people are sort of consolidating. Then there's the period of the big spike, which is when government funding comes in, government infrastructure is created, roads, networks, connectivity. There's a peak, and then there's an invariable slump. And you see this graph everywhere. You see this in population, you see this in cities like Detroit, which have grown exponentially and are right now shrinking. So you can actually see population in cities following the same sort of slump. And we think we're onto something here, but we're not really sure where that's going. So what we started doing was to visualize Bombay using the boomtown future. So looking at rising sea levels. This is the Haji Ali in 2015. And that's the Haji Ali in 2025, where half the monument is submerged and people have started scuba pilgrimages. So you can actually go visit the Dargah using scuba gear. So anyway, that's things that we do. We're doing some transmedia experiments in Goa as well. So we're engaging a lot with virtual reality, trying to create augmented reality situations to sort of engage with these futures. These are some of the initial mappings of old Goan homes. So we're using very simple camera phone based technologies called like photogrammetry to actually create very evocative lived monuments, and then one can layer a lot of narratives onto this. So we're trying to pitch this to Intact, to sort of government actors in Goa, also plugging into the activist network there to see how we can make virtual reality sort of engagement models. This is a hypothetical hacked together model of a re-smokers fort, and we're trying to use the re-smokers fort as a craft emporium to sort of get people to walk through this fort and engage with local Goan craft and try to see what that future could be like, for example. So that's some screen grabs from the visualization. I think one of the things that we're actively trying to do is to engage in education and outreach, because I feel like a lot of this is, the process itself needs to be inclusive. As long as we're doing this sitting in our own silos and being more prescriptive than descriptive, it's a recipe for disaster. So I feel one of the things that we are very actively doing is to run labs. This is the first lab we did on conservation, again with just a 1 degree of separation of friends and people who we whose opinion we value, call them all to Goa. So on this table we had wildlife conservationists talking about best case practices in conserving wildlife, and we were looking at how those best case practices could be used to augment architectural practice. We had filmmakers who have worked in the Andamans for a long time, and they were looking at conserving indigenous knowledge systems, about studying how a shaman goes into the forest and forages. So they've strapped him with a GoPro, and he's walked into the forest and come back with all these herbs. And they're like, okay, why didn't you just pick up the third leaf, which is at the bottom of the stalk? He's saying, because that's the right amount of wetness. The top two leaves are too wet because of the, because of the rain falling on them. The third leaf is the right one. And these kind of knowledge it's just impossible to gather this kind of data without the right technique. It's impossible to go and sit with this guy, you don't speak his language. It's impossible to go sit across the table and say, why did you do this, right? I mean, you have to study what he did and then ask him pointed questions. So we're trying to adapt a lot of these research techniques and tools and tricks towards creating more meaningful architectural interventions. I'd like to end this just with open-ended questions that we're thinking about right now. Why speculate in the first place? What does it do to us as a design profession, and how does it further our thinking? What we've realized is that it sort of creates believable realities. It's very important. I think what Elon Musk has done singularly has created a fascination for the exploration of space. He's driven countries to join the space exploration paradigm again, which is, after man reached the moon, there's been nothing done for the last 40 years. And suddenly people are now excited about Mars, suddenly people are excited about interstellar exploration. And it's pretty much one guy trying to create, he's selling the whole world as a two-planetary race as a sort of a sales propaganda. And, we're all buying into it and we're all excited about it. I think that's a very, very clear benefit of speculative and futures thinking for designers in particular. I think it also allows us to democratize our process. Most of where we've massively screwed up in the past has been because we've sat in our own studio and assumed that this is what people want, when actually the truth is very, very far from that. As soon as we engage in democratizing processes which allow for us to be part of labs and workshops, and when decisions are taken in that sort of an inclusive fashion, they become a lot more meaningful, especially in working with culture. I think it also allows us to map preferable futures. I think this is a big one because the word preferable is very important. Like, it's not just mapping techno-deterministic futures where technology is saying this is where it's going. I think some of the discussions that were on the stage earlier are primarily focusing on techno-deterministic futures, which is not the entire picture, right? I mean, we all have the choice to choose our futures, and we can say, okay, that's where we want to go. And I think it also allows us to be better prepared and more resilient. Like if we say to learn from the experience of Bombay flooding every year, how does it actually change our design of public space, and how does it actually allow us to be better prepared? So if one is able to futurecast and able to speculate and say, okay, this is going to happen again, what are we going to do in 10 years' time? How do we make, for example, right now we're working in Dharavi as part of the Street Art Foundation. We're trying to create floating architecture, which is actually tethered to the ground. It's nice pieces of art that are lying on the ground, and they float up to the highest flood level as soon as that area floods. So it becomes an impromptu gangway and walkway. So it allows you to do a zero budget intervention under the name of art, but still be in line with city resilience. And if I had to sum it up in one word, I feel it has left us with a sense of cautious optimism. It's very easy to be cynical and pessimistic, especially in the current political climate that we have in India right now. It's extremely easy to lapse into some sort of disjointed nationalism. But I feel if designers lapse into that, then something massive is lost. And I feel if we're able to take back a sense of cautious optimism from this, saying we're not crazy sci-fi writers at the end of the day. I mean, we're not people who are visualizing utopias or dystopias. We're actually the people who are creating these utopias and dystopias. So to be cautiously optimistic, I feel is a good takeaway for us from some of these experiments that we're doing. Yeah, thank you so much.